The bench outside the Sunoco station on Route 12 in Calvary, North Carolina, population 3,100, had one broken slat and a wad of gum stuck to the armrest that had been there so long it had turned the color of concrete. Nobody sat on that bench. It faced the gas pumps and the two-lane highway and the Dollar General across the street, and the only shade came from a Bradford pear tree that smelled like something dying every spring. It was not a place where things happened. But on a Saturday afternoon in August of 2004, something happened there that would take 20 years to finish. A man sat on that bench at 2:47 p.m., put his face in his hands, and cried. Not the quiet kind. Not the kind you can swallow. The kind that comes up from the floor of you and doesn't ask permission. The kind that bends your shoulders and shakes your chest and makes sounds that don't belong to language. He was 6'2", 241 pounds, wearing a leather vest and boots that had highway dust ground into the creases. His motorcycle was parked at Pump 3, still ticking from the heat of 400 miles of road. His helmet sat on the ground beside him, like something he'd dropped and didn't have the strength to pick up. His road name was Forge. His real name was Daniel Aaron Kessler. He was 29 years old, and 3 hours earlier, he had buried his mother. Her name was Lorraine. She was 54. Ovarian cancer. 8 months from the day the doctor said the word to the morning, Daniel sat beside her hospital bed in Asheville and watched her chest stop moving and realized that the sound a room makes when someone dies in it is not silence. It's the absence of a breath you'd been counting on without knowing it. She was the only family he had. His father had left when Daniel was 4. A man named Gerald who vanished into a bottle and then into a state line and then into nothing. There were no siblings, no aunts, no cousins who kept in touch. Lorraine Kessler had been his mother and his father and his best friend, and the only person on earth who called him Danny. He'd ridden the funeral alone. He'd stood at the grave alone. He'd watched the dirt cover the box alone. And then he'd gotten on his bike and ridden south without a destination, because stopping meant being in a room, and being in a room meant being in it without her, and he couldn't do that yet. He couldn't do that at all. So he stopped at a Sunoco station in a town he'd never heard of, and he sat on a bench with a broken slat, and he fell apart. Nobody approached him. The woman inside the station watched through the glass and didn't come out. A man filling his truck at Pump 1 looked away and kept pumping. A family in a minivan pulled in, saw the crying biker, and pulled around to the far side of the lot. Abernathy. She had red hair that didn't Abernathy. She had red hair that didn't cooperate with anything. Not brushes, not barrettes, not gravity. She was wearing a yellow dress that was too long for her because it was a hand-me-down from her cousin in Raleigh, and she'd rolled the sleeves up 3 times so her hands were free. As she was holding a sheet of paper and a crayon, green, worn down to a nub so short she had to grip it with her whole fist. She'd been sitting in the back seat of her mother's car, parked at Pump 4, drawing while her mother, Ruth Ann Abernathy, went inside to pay. Sophie had looked up from her drawing, seen the man on the bench, and done what every adult in that parking lot had decided not to do. She got out of the car. She walked across the lot. She stopped in front of him. Daniel didn't see her at first. His hands were over his eyes. His shoulders were shaking. The world was a blur of heat and gasoline and a grief so big it had swallowed every other thing he knew. Then he felt a tap on his knee. Small. Light. Barely there. He looked up. A 7-year-old girl with red hair and a too long yellow dress was holding out a piece of paper. On it, in green crayon, was a drawing. 2 stick figures standing side by side under something that was either a tree or a very tall piece of broccoli. One figure was big, one was small. Between them, connecting their stick figure hands, was a wobbly green line. Above the figures, in letters that leaned in different directions like they'd been written on a boat, was a single word. Okay. You look sad, Sophie said. I made this for you. You can keep it. Daniel looked at the drawing. He looked at the girl. Now he opened his mouth and nothing came out. Not a word, not a sound. Just the raw silence of a man who had been emptied and was being offered something by a person who had no idea what she was giving. It's you and me, Sophie said, pointing. That's the big one. That's you. That's the little one. That's me. And that, she pointed to the line connecting their hands, means you're not by yourself. Daniel took the drawing. His hands were shaking. He folded it once, carefully, yet the way you fold something that matters, and put it in the inside pocket of his vest, against his chest. Thank you, he said. His voice was wrecked. You're welcome, Sophie said. Then she turned and walked back to the car, climbed in, and picked up another crayon, like the whole thing had been no more complicated than handing someone a napkin. Ruth Ann came out of the station 30 seconds later, got in the car, and drove away. She didn't know what her daughter had done. Sophie didn't tell her. The drawing was already in Daniel's vest, pressed against his heart, and the car was already pulling onto Route 12. And the moment was already over. Or that's what everyone would have thought. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be over for 20 years. What happened between that afternoon and the morning Daniel Kessler walked Sophie Abernathy down the aisle of Calvary First Methodist on October 19th, 2024, is a story that spans 2 decades, 2 lives, and a town that almost destroyed one of them. But to understand the walk down the aisle, you first have to understand what happened to Sophie. And to understand what happened to Sophie, you have to understand a man named Vernon. Daniel Kessler rode out of Calvary that afternoon and kept going south. He rode for 3 more days. He slept in motel rooms that smelled like mildew and regret. He ate at diners where nobody knew his name and nobody asked why his eyes were red. And every night, and before he turned off the light, he took the drawing out of his vest and unfolded it and looked at it. 2 stick figures, a green line, the word okay. He didn't know the girl's name. He didn't know the town. He'd barely registered the name on the gas station. Sunoco, Route 12, somewhere in North Carolina. But the drawing went into the cedar box where he kept the only things that mattered. His mother's wedding ring, his first patch, a photograph of Lorraine holding him as a baby on the porch of the house in Asheville where he grew up. The drawing stayed in that box for 6 years. Then it came out. It went back into his vest, in the inside pocket, against his chest. It stayed there for the next 14 years. Through rain and road dust and 3 motorcycle accidents and a divorce that lasted longer than the marriage. It stayed because Daniel Kessler had decided, somewhere in the dark of a motel room in 2004, that the drawing was proof of something. Proof that a stranger could see your pain and walk toward it instead of away. Proof that kindness could come from a person too young to know what it cost. Proof that the word okay, written in crooked green letters by a 7-year-old hand, could mean more than any sermon or eulogy or condolence card he'd ever received. He never went looking for the girl. He didn't know where to look. But he carried her with him the way some people carry a prayer, not as a plan, but as a promise that the world contained something worth believing in. Now, Sophie Claire Abernathy grew up in Calvary the way most children grow up in small towns. Slowly, predictably, in a house where the walls knew her voice and the neighbors knew her name. Ruth Ann worked at the elementary school as a reading aide. Sophie's father, James Abernathy, managed the hardware store on Birch Street. And they lived in a 3-bedroom house on Dunlap Road with a porch swing and a garden and a dog named Clyde who was old and slow and perfect. James died when Sophie was 12. Heart attack. January 14th, 2009. He was 44. He was carrying a box of light bulbs from the stockroom to the front counter when his left arm went numb and his knees buckled and he was dead before the paramedics got the truck out of the station. Sophie was in school when it happened. She was in Miss Nani Parrish's 6th grade math class, working on fractions, when the principal came to the door and said her mother was in the office. She knew before anyone told her. She knew from the sound of the principal's shoes in the hallway. She knew from the way Ms. Parrish's face changed. She knew the way children know things, in their body, before their mind catches up. After James died, Ruth Ann struggled. She kept working. She kept the house. She kept Sophie fed and clothed and in school. But the hardware store closed. Nobody wanted to buy it. Nobody wanted to run it. And without James, it was just a building full of hammers and grief. Ruth Ann's income dropped from $38,000 a year to $19,000. They lived on that, and James's small life insurance policy, which covered the mortgage for 2 years and then ran out. And then Vernon Ward appeared. Vernon was 51 when he entered their lives. He was a real estate appraiser with an office above the barber shop on Main Street. And he wore clean button-downs and pressed slacks and shoes that were always polished. He attended Calvary First Methodist every Sunday, the same church where James Abernathy's funeral had been held, and sang in the men's choir with a baritone that people called a gift. He coached the middle school cross-country team. He organized the church's annual coat drive. The Calvary Courier had profiled him twice, once for the coat drive and once for donating $3,000 to repair the church roof after a storm in 2016. Vernon started coming around in 2011, 2 years after James died. He helped Ruth Ann with the taxes. He helped her refinance the mortgage. He drove Sophie to cross-country practice when Ruth Ann's car was in the shop. He brought groceries on Thursdays, always the right things, always with a smile, as always staying just long enough to be helpful and not long enough to be intrusive. Ruth Ann started dating him in 2012. They married in 2014, when Sophie was 17. Sophie didn't like Vernon. She couldn't explain why. He was polite, he was helpful. He said the right things at the right times. But something about him felt like a door that was painted to look open, but was actually locked. And every time Sophie tried to say this to her mother, Ruth Ann would smile and say, "Honey, you just need time to adjust." Sophie stopped trying to say it. She graduated high school in 2015. She moved to Wilmington for college. She came home on holidays. She watched Vernon from a distance the way you watch weather, looking for the change that you know is coming but can't predict. The change came slowly. Vernon's help became control the way fog becomes rain, gradually, and then all at once. He convinced Ruth Ann to add his name to the deed of the house. That he convinced her to consolidate their bank accounts. He managed the bills. He managed the budget. He managed the schedule. Ruth Ann, who had been running a household and a job and a daughter's life on her own for 5 years, found herself being managed into a smaller and smaller space inside her own home. By 2018, Vernon controlled every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out. Ruth Ann had a weekly allowance of $60 for groceries. She asked permission to buy new shoes. She asked permission to visit her sister in Raleigh. She asked and asked and asked until asking felt normal and not asking felt dangerous. He never hit her. He was careful about that. He never raised his voice in public. He never left a mark. He left something worse. The absence of a mark, the kind of damage that doesn't bruise the skin, but bruises the person underneath it until they can't remember what they looked like before. He isolated Ruth Ann from the church women's group by telling them she was dealing with depression and needed space. He told Sophie, during a phone call in 2019, calm and measured, that Ruth Ann was fragile and that Sophie's visits agitated her, and that it might be better if Sophie called less often. Sophie was 22. She was working 2 jobs in Wilmington. She was exhausted and trusting, and she believed him because he said it in a voice that sounded like concern. Sophie called Les. She visited Les. The distance between her and her mother grew, and Vernon filled it the way water fills a crack, silently, completely, until there was no space left. By 2023, Ruth Ann Abernathy Ward was 56 years old and living in her own house like a guest who wasn't sure she was welcome. She had lost 22 pounds. She had stopped gardening. She had stopped reading. The porch swing hadn't moved in 3 years. The dog, Clyde, had died in 2021, and Vernon said they didn't need another one. Sophie knew something was wrong. She could hear it in her mother's voice. The pauses that lasted too long. The laughter that came at the wrong moments. The way Ruth Ann said, "Everything's fine." The way people say things that are the opposite of true. In September of 2023, Sophie drove home unannounced. She walked into the house at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday and found her mother sitting in the kitchen in the dark with the curtains drawn, yet wearing the same clothes she'd worn the last time Sophie had FaceTimed her 4 days earlier. Ruth Ann looked at her daughter and said, "Please don't tell Vernon you're here." That sentence, 8 words whispered in a dark kitchen, broke the lock. Now here's where the road opens. Here's where 20 years of a drawing in a vest pocket finally means something. If you're watching from Calvary or anywhere in North Carolina, drop your location in the comments. And if this story has already gotten its hands around your throat, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the man who wept on that gas station bench in 2004, the man who carried a 7-year-old's drawing against his chest for 2 decades, is about to walk back into Sophie's life. And when he does, everything changes. Stay with me. Sophie didn't know what to do. She was 26. She had no money for a lawyer. She had no proof of anything except a feeling and a sentence whispered in the dark. She started asking questions in Calvary. Carefully, quietly, the way you pull a thread when you're afraid the whole thing will unravel. She talked to the women who used to be in Ruth Ann's church group. She talked to the pharmacist who filled Ruth Ann's prescriptions and noticed she'd stopped picking them up herself. She talked to the neighbor who said she hadn't seen Ruth Ann in the front yard in over a year. The picture built itself, piece by piece. That's the way all pictures of quiet abuse build themselves, not with a single damning fact, but with 100 small ones that only make sense when you step back far enough to see the pattern. And then, in November of 2023, Sophie walked into a diner in Wilmington and sat down at a table near the window. At the counter, drinking coffee alone, was a man in a leather vest with a patch that said, "Forge." He was 49 now. His beard had gone gray. His hands were thicker. But he was the same man, at the same build, the same stillness. Sophie didn't recognize him. How could she? She'd been 7. But Daniel recognized her, not her face. 20 years had changed that. He recognized the hair, red, uncooperative, refusing to be anything other than what it was. He recognized something in the way she sat, hunched forward, elbows on the table, carrying something heavy. He'd seen that posture before, in a mirror, on a gas station bench, and in every man he'd ever known who was trying to hold it together and failing. He didn't approach her. Not then. But he heard her on the phone, a conversation with someone named Ruth Ann, a conversation that included the words, "He won't let me," and "I don't know what to do," and "Mom, please." He heard enough. 2 days later, through a chain of contacts and conversations that moved through the club, the way information moves through families. Laterally, quickly, yet without bureaucracy, Daniel Kessler had a name. Vernon Ward, Calvary, North Carolina. And within a week, he had a file. The file was built by the same network that had built files before. Retired paralegals, forensic accountants, people who knew how to read a property deed and a bank statement and a pattern of control that hid behind good manners and choir practice. They found the deed transfer. They found the consolidated accounts. Now they found the isolation pattern, the canceled church group, the reduced visits, the prescriptions that went unfilled. They found that Vernon had quietly taken a second mortgage on the house without Ruth Ann's informed consent, borrowing $42,000 against a property she'd owned outright since 2011. Daniel called Dutch. Dutch called the chapters. The chapters called their people. On a Saturday morning in January of 2024, Sophie Abernathy drove to Calvary expecting to meet one man, a biker named Forge who'd said he could help. She pulled up to the Sunoco station on Route 12, the same station, the same lot, the same bench with the broken slat, and found 47 motorcycles parked in a line along the highway. Daniel was standing by the bench. He was holding a piece of paper. Sophie got out of her car. She walked toward him. She looked at the paper in his hand. It was a drawing. Green crayon on white paper, faded and worn at the folds, soft as cloth from 20 years of being carried. 2 stick figures, a wobbly line between their hands. The word, okay. "You gave me this," Daniel said. "August 2004. I was sitting on that bench. I'd just buried my mother. You were 7 years old and you walked across this parking lot and handed me this drawing. And you said, 'You're not by yourself.'" Sophie stared at the drawing. She stared at Daniel. Her hand went to her mouth. "I've carried it every day since," Daniel said. "In my vest, against my chest, 20 years, because it was the only thing that made me believe I was going to be okay." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "And now you need help. And I'm here. And you are not by yourself." Behind him, 46 men and women in leather stood beside their bikes in the January cold, breath rising, faces still. And they had ridden from Greenville and Charlotte and Asheville and Wilmington, because Daniel Kessler had called in 20 years of brotherhood for a woman who had once been a girl who had once given a stranger the only thing she had. By noon, a legal team assembled from club contacts had met with Ruth Ann in her own kitchen, with Vernon absent, at work, unaware. They documented everything. By the following week, Ruth Ann had an attorney. By the end of the month, she had filed for divorce, and a restraining order, and a fraud complaint related to the unauthorized mortgage. Vernon Ward was served papers on a Tuesday morning at his office above the barber shop. He came downstairs and found 11 motorcycles parked along the curb, 11 riders standing beside them, arms folded, quiet. He went back upstairs. He called his lawyer. He did not go to choir practice that Wednesday. The divorce was finalized in June 2024. The house was returned to Ruth Ann's sole ownership. The unauthorized mortgage was voided. Vernon was charged with financial exploitation and fraud. He pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to 2 years and court-ordered restitution of $42,000. Ruth Ann opened the curtains. She started gardening again. Tomatoes, basil, marigolds, the same things she'd grown when James was alive. She adopted a dog from the shelter in Asheville, a mutt named Biscuit, who was old and slow and perfect. And she sat on the porch swing every evening and watched the road and remembered what it felt like to live in her own house like it was hers. On October 19th, 2024, Sophie Claire Abernathy married a man named Eli James Tucker at Calvary First Methodist. She wore her mother's veil. She carried white peonies. The church was full. Ruth Ann in the front pew, crying the kind of tears that mean the opposite of sadness. Eli's family on the right side, and Sophie's friends from Wilmington filling the rows behind them. Sophie had no father to walk her down the aisle. James Abernathy had been gone for 15 years. There was no uncle, no grandfather, no brother. She asked Daniel. He wore a dark suit, no vest, no patches. Just a man in a suit with a green crayon drawing folded in his breast pocket. Walking a 27-year-old woman down the center aisle of a church in a town where, 20 years earlier, he had wept on a gas station bench and a child had given him the only thing she had. At the altar, before he let go of her arm, Daniel reached into his pocket. He pulled out a brass coin, the same one he'd carried since he became sergeant at arms, the same one that had sat next to the drawing in his vest for years. On one side, the chapter insignia. On the other, family. He pressed it into Sophie's palm. "Your dad would have been proud," he said. "Yeah, I know I am." Sophie closed her fingers around the coin. She looked at the man who had carried her drawing for 20 years. She said, "You kept your promise." "What promise?" "The drawing. It said, okay. That was a promise." She smiled, the same smile, the one that doesn't hold anything back. "We're both okay now." Daniel nodded. He let go of her arm. He stepped to the side. He sat in the second pew, next to Ruth Ann, who reached over without looking and took his hand. The way you take the hand of someone who has become family so gradually that you can't remember the moment it happened. Only that it did. The drawing is framed now. It hangs in Sophie and Eli's hallway, between their wedding photograph and a picture of James Abernathy holding Sophie as a baby on the porch of the house on Dunlap Road. 2 stick figures. A green line. The word okay, faded and soft at the folds. So 20 years of road dust and rain and a man's heartbeat pressed into the paper. Some things take 20 years to finish. Some promises are made by children who don't know they're making them. Some families are built not by blood, but by a single moment of courage. A 7-year-old walking across a parking lot toward a man the whole world had decided to leave alone. If this story reached something in you that you thought was buried, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing they did, the small, quiet, unwitnessed thing, mattered. Share it with someone who's carrying a drawing in their pocket and doesn't know yet what it's going to become. And remember this: the child who walks toward the pain, the man who carries the kindness, the woman who opens the curtains after years in the dark, they are the code. They are the road. They are family. And they are proof that the word okay, written in green crayon by a hand too small to know what it was doing, can hold a man together for 20 years and bring him home.